Good evening and welcome to another conversation by the Elephant TV. And this time it's my pleasure to be speaking to Mr. Namir Shabibi, who is a British investigative journalist who has written and produced documentaries for the BBC, Vice, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He also previously worked as delegate for the International Committee for the Red Cross in Darfur and Guantanamo Bay. Welcome, Namir. The reason we're speaking with you today is an article that was published by the South African publication, The Maverick, on the 28th of August, titled The CIA and MI6 Secret War in Kenya. The detailed, quote unquote, the war against terror in Kenya and the way it's playing out, with a level of detail that many of us Kenyans have not been, haven't seen before. As you know, Kenya has been. I always tell people Kenya was attacked by Al Qaeda before the US. The US embassy bombings that took place here in 1998, and I visited them about 15 minutes after the blast and spent into the night there. So we have some experience with groups like Al Qaeda and its regional offshoot Al Shabaab, which has engaged in a number of pretty dramatic and destructive terrorist activities here. But your piece detailed how the effort to mitigate the bad work that the terrorists do is how that is being prosecuted. And I was wondering, first of all, just to ask quite a simple question: how and why did Namir Shabibi end up being the guy who is interested in the prosecution of this effort here in Kenya? What made you? What caused you to be interested in the fight against a group like Al Shabaab in our part of the world?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for having me, John, and the team from the Elephant. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. And this investigation, which was published last Saturday, which was a joint publication by the Daily Maverick and Declassified UK, a British outlet that works with the Daily Maverick to publish investigations into national security and issues involving the United States and the UK. And my journey on this story starts actually a few years ago. I had had the pleasure of producing a documentary in Kenya for Vice, and the documentary concerned abuses by KWS, Kenya Wildlife Service paramilitaries in the Meru National Park area and surrounding. And my specific interest in counterterrorism also comes from my work as a public interest investigator, where I've worked to build cases cases of disappearances, renditions, torture, cases for legal action. So the focus is very much on developing the facts of a case. Now, what I noticed with Kenya was that it felt to me that there was a significant gap in reporting of the covert war on terror. There were night raids happening in Kenya every few weeks, sometimes every week at its peak, or more than once a week at its peak, typically along the coast of Kenya, Mombasa and its surroundings, where plainclothes police, well armed, would go in before dawn, between around 2 and 4 a.m. in the morning, turn up in unmarked vehicles, Toyota Land Cruisers typically, holding M4 carbine rifles, and going in with proper body armor, the kind of levels of equipment and skill that you do not see typically in Kenyan police. So these anecdotal reports of these raids, which reported that typically a terror suspect would end up dead, had me asking, well, who is behind those raids? Because that's not normal Kenyan police. Ordinary Kenyan police are poorly funded, lack motivation, not armed properly. They often don't have body armor when they're going into these kinds of actions. So clearly this is a highly trained, well-armed team. So I started looking into it and learned that there was a covert clandestine team that sits within the Recce Company. The Recce Company has a number of special teams.
This is the Recce Company of the General Service Unit.
Correct, yes. The Recce Company has special operations like special teams, and they all have different purposes, from presidential escorting to vital installation protection, really important things for Kenya's national security. But one of these special teams is what's colloquially known as the Renditions Operations Team, and I'll come on to why they're named that, but formerly known as the Rapid Response Team. And what I found was that the CIA had set up that team alongside Kenya's National Intelligence Service, trained and armed that team, and provided regular mentoring to it, even assisted directly on operations since 2004 and up until this present day. And once I started pulling on this thread, it just got more and more interesting, because here is a war being prosecuted entirely in the shadows for over 15 years that nobody's picked up on. And I think it hasn't been picked up on because I think that journalists and human rights activists were satisfying themselves for a long time to say such and such a raid was perpetrated by the anti-terrorism police unit, which cannot be true in the case of night special operations type raids. Now, the reason it can't be true is because the ATPU, they're an investigative outfit belonging to the CID, Kenya's DCI. And those are detectives. So those detectives don't have the equipment or the training to kick down doors and nab high value or high risk terror suspects. So the more I learned about this team, the more I began to understand their reasons for existing, because Kenya was facing a serious threat against its tourism industry by high value, large scale terrorist attacks of the types that we're all familiar with. There's no need to recount them right now. And that Kenya needed, and the CIA felt it needed a capacity to take down these suspects. Now, by take down, I don't mean necessarily that they always kill them, and it wouldn't be fair to represent it in that way. In fact, that the team, once it was set up in 2004, and the team started with 18 commandos, known as Team 18. It's grown to around 60, and the numbers have ebbed and flowed in the meantime. Actually, the team around 2013 to 15 lost a number of its operatives to the private sector. Kenya Airways nabbed quite a lot of them for airline security purposes. But since being set up in 2004, the team was largely dormant for the first few years as Kenya's NIS and the CIA and Britain's MI6 were working their intelligence on certain targets. But then as Kenya started getting hit with high-profile abductions of tourists, terrorist attacks against hotels and the like, and then of course the spectacular attack against the rugby club and restaurant in Kampala in 2010, the team, the Rapid Response Team, otherwise known as the Renditions Operations Team, starts to get busy. And those are in the words of a former senior CIA counterterrorism official. And they start to get busy because this team is principally skilled at facing high value and high risk counterterrorism suspects. And more of those there were in Nairobi and along the coast, the more that team gets involved. But the most disturbing finding of all of this is, whereas many of the terror targets that the team was tasked to kill or capture, because that's its mandate, either it needs to capture that suspect or it has to kill him, one of the two. Between the years 2004 to 2010, the team was mostly involved in renditions operations, feeding suspects into the CIA's extraordinary renditions program. But after that, the logic of the team and the modus operandi of the team and the rules of engagement of that team appears to have shifted. In fairness to the team, it was facing a greater threat, but more and more dead bodies would emerge on the coast of Mombasa as a result of that team's night raids. And that asks a number of questions about to what extent that team is held accountable, both by the Kenyan authorities, so that's the GSU, the Ministry of Interior, the presidency, but also the US government, including the CIA. Because these guys, for example, one of the former senior CIA counterterrorism officials told me that providing such assistance to the team as it did, arming them, training them, providing them with allowances, even giving them body armor where the Kenya Police Service wouldn't. Quote, he says it puts them under our control, you know? And so once a team like that is under your control, you're responsible for its mistakes and its abuses. But what I could find very little of in the course of this investigation was accountability, internally or externally.
Okay. Namir, can you just give us an overview of your investigation that you carried out that led to the articles that we've read? Just for those who may not have seen them, I found them very, very compelling, and then we can discuss details that emerge out of that.
Well, I've spoken just earlier about some aspects of the history and the logic of the CIA and Kenya's National Intelligence Service, NIS, setting up the team and how it provided support to the clandestine rapid response team that sits within the recce company of the GSU. What I want to talk a bit more about now in terms of my findings is some of the mistakes that team has made, some of the successes as well. For example, I found that in 2009, the rapid response team disrupted an operation to kill the visiting Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, one of its major successes. It also captured, and you're all in Kenya by now sick of hearing his name, I'm sure, the team also captured Jermaine Grant, the British terror suspect who's alleged to have trained with Shabaab in Somalia and is an associate of the White Widow. But some of the operations that I was told about by rapid response team members, both former and current, were altogether more disturbing. Some of them were botched killings. Some of them involved potential summary executions of terror targets. Some of them involved the killing of a pregnant wife of a terror suspect. And it's difficult to know, well, it's near impossible to know what happened in those rooms when those raids took place, because there's nobody to tell the story afterwards. But let me tell you about a few of the stories. Perhaps the most disturbing one was a raid in October 2012 by the rapid response team against, as they were hunting for a terror target called Fuad Abu Bakr Mansour, supposedly an accomplice of Jermaine Grant and of those circles. Now, what I learned about that operation from sources who had direct knowledge of it was that the NIS and the rapid response team were working together to hunt for that particular target. And they had an intelligence informant, a gentleman known by the name of Titus Nabiswa. Titus Nabiswa led the officers to the wrong house in Mombasa. This is in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. And the Kenyan paramilitaries, that's the CIA-backed paramilitaries, tried to enter the house, and its occupants, who were the wrong people, were a man and his wife. This man, the gentleman called Omar Faraj, was a cashier at a local butcher. So a very predictable pattern of life.
Yeah.
If he was a target and you'd wanted to arrest him, you could have just walked down to his butcher, said, I'll have a pound of meat, and I'll also have that guy over there because he's who I want. But they didn't, because clearly he wasn't the guy who was wanted. So Omar and his wife feared that they were being invaded by armed robbers, because there was a heavy and well-armed presence by plainclothes men outside of their house. So they attempt to flee. Now the CIA-backed rapid response team fires tear gas into the house, and it catches up with Omar and his wife, who were trying to flee their compound, their house, and to cross over into the neighbor's house. And they shoot Omar in the temple, killing him almost instantaneously. And they shoot him with M4 carbine rifles that are provided by the US government. Now, his wife, in an attempt to avoid being killed, takes Omar's blood and covers herself with it and plays dead. And the rapid response team officers believe that they haven't killed her too, because they stand over her and say, we finished the job. This is what she overheard them saying. They leave. Now, of course, the anti-terrorism police unit do what it normally does, which it comes in after such raids and secures the crime scene. And obviously it does what it does from there. And that rapid response team goes immediately back to base in Ruiru. What happens later is that the intelligence informant, Titus Nabiswa, having led the team to the wrong house, is found with his body dumped and a gunshot wound to his head. Now, the police claim after this operation, as it does always, that it killed terrorists. Nothing more, nothing less. And nothing in response to news reports that it killed a local cashier at a butcher. Now, one of the officers who has direct knowledge of that operation confided to me what happened that evening, that the intelligence informants led the team to the wrong house and they killed the wrong person. So the question I have, among many others, is how many other botched killings is this team guilty of? We know of some of its successes. Another case that I uncovered was from 2013, the case of Kasim Amolo, a so-called high-value terrorism suspect. When NIS officers guided the rapid response team to his home, his family told researchers from Muhuri, an open society, that the rapid response team officers told the family that we were sent to kill you. And from then on, if a person is, of course, defenseless and captive, if you kill that person, it's a summary execution. There's little doubt about that there. So did the team summarily execute Kasim Amolo, is the question that emerges there. And another operation dating from 2014 in Githurai, in the suburb of Nairobi, police claimed that they were, two suspects were resisting arrest, and so they killed them. It turns out that that suspect was killed alongside his pregnant wife. And 4 witnesses told Human Rights Watch that the GSU team that came in did not encounter any resistance at all. So is this another case of summary execution involving that team? Again, we don't know, because some of the officers involved in that clandestine team told me that there is strength in our secrecy. The fact that people don't know about our operations, they blame it on other police units, that we go in unmarked cars, that our intelligence support is a secret, and those who back us are a secret, keeps us outside and away from scrutiny. And that's one of the most disturbing things about this, because Kenya is a functioning, for all its flaws, is a functioning democracy, as a country that prides itself on the rule of law. So what is a team like this doing, kicking down doors to homes in Mombasa and in Nairobi and shooting dead people in these circumstances? That's not to mention, of course, the issue of renditions across East Africa is well known and covered by other journalists. Alameen Kamathi has done a lot of important work on the renditions across East Africa, for example, among others. But I learned also that the CIA-backed squad were responsible for some of the renditions as well. And that wasn't previously known. In fact, an officer working for the Kenyan clandestine team told me that the CIA even paid for the fuel for these paramilitaries to undertake their operations, where they would capture someone in Nairobi and Mombasa and drive them all the way to the border with Uganda and then hand them over to their counterparts of the Ugandans. This is very close cooperation. We're not just talking handing them money once a month. A former senior US official with direct knowledge of that program said that, you know, we don't just hand these teams money once a month. We are much more involved in them. There is a liaison at the US Embassy right now. There's a CIA paramilitary officer who has regular contact, physical contact with the team, provides them support, allowances, weapons, training. They brief them before an operation. They debrief them after an operation. They are intimately integrated into these operations. And all of that goes back to this integration between the CIA and its local counterparts. All of that goes back to 1998, the bombings that you alluded to, when the CIA had a wake-up call, as Henry Crumpton described it, a wake-up call to say that we needed...
Sorry, Henry Crumpton?
Henry Crumpton has had many roles. He's best known as a master of covert operations. He worked at the CIA for a long time as an undercover operations officer. He served as the CIA's deputy for the Counterterrorism Center. He also was seconded to the FBI. He told me a fascinating story about taking in a Kenyan police officer of Somali origin and taking him over to the United States to perform an undercover operation to infiltrate a suspected terrorist gang in the United States. That's what Crumpton meant by integrated operations. There was this intimate exchange between human resources and as well as mutual support that would allow disruption of terrorist planning both in Kenya but also in the United States. Henry Crumpton, of course, is also credited with leading the CIA's war in Afghanistan, 2001, because it was very much that war, the invasion of Afghanistan and the war subsequent to that was very much led by the CIA, actually. And this speaks to something I know that we should talk about at some point, something that's Crumpton referred to as an intelligence-driven war.
I was going to ask about that, and just ask you. You know, I mean, you've not only worked in Kenya, but you've worked in other theaters where this kind of efforts against terror are being prosecuted. What does it mean when they talk of an intelligence-driven war? I mean, what does it mean on the ground, ultimately? Yeah.
Well, first I'd encourage your listeners not to take Henry Crumpton's statement that it's an intelligence-driven war necessarily at face value. Mr. Crumpton is a very distinguished person, but he also comes from a particular background. He is an intelligence man. He's a proud ex-CIA senior. And of course, the CIA has long been arguing and gained the lead in counterterrorism dating back to 1998.
Yes.
During the attack on the embassy in Kenya. And they got that. They got that in response to the 98 attack and the 2001 September 11th attacks. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, what he's arguing, I think, is two things. I think he's arguing about the nature of terrorist groups like Al Qaeda in particular. In the early 2000s, that these groups would operate in a clandestine fashion as cells to prepare for spectacular high-value terrorist attacks against civilians or against vital installations that we've seen many times by Al Qaeda, and that the nature of that planning by covert terrorist cells necessitates a covert intelligence-driven response by agencies that have the powers to send in undercover agents to infiltrate those organizations like Al Qaeda and subsequently Shabaab, and that they have the tools to do it from eavesdropping or other forms of surveillance, and aren't restricted in the same way that law enforcement organizations aren't restricted. But at the same time, John, it's important to remember that, yes, Crumpton argues quite interestingly that this is an intelligence-driven war. But the flip side of it is this. If you take what many argue is a law enforcement issue, counterterrorism being a law enforcement issue in places like the UK and Kenya and so on, and you drive it into the shadows, that's NIS and the CIA-backed rapid response team, then you've got a problem of accountability for these teams. Because I don't know about your intelligence services in Kenya as I know about mine over here, but ours are pretty unaccountable, I think it's fair to say. Even at the height of its greatest excesses in the aftermath of 9/11, such as the extraordinary rendition program and torture. So there is a problem with that, with operating these counterterrorism operations in that fashion. And the most obvious drawback from that is that Kenya for a long time has been in the dark about who perpetrates night raids against high value or high risk terrorist suspects. It's only coming out now. And there must be a real concern for you as civil society to find out so belatedly that the US and NIS and this GSU clandestine team plays such a pivotal role in taking down terrorist suspects.
A question, Namir, just to take us back a little bit. These are efforts that started being planned after 1998, picked up steam after around 2003, 2004, how have things changed since 2016 with the election of Donald Trump in the United States, where the remit of the CIA in terms of the American war against terror seems to have been expanded quite significantly? Has that impacted, from what you found, has that impacted operations in Kenya and the methodologies that are used within Kenya?
Yeah, well, I don't think that, I think the Kenyan context has to be taken in the broader context, but also be considered on its own. And that's important because the counterterrorism context in Kenya doesn't look anything like what it does in Somalia, nor does it look like what it is in Afghanistan or Yemen. It's a very different situation. You have yes, you have a clandestine threat from Shabaab in Somalia, but Shabaab operates in significant military style or paramilitary style large formations that that necessitates a military response, such as, for example, the use of drones in Somalia, which you don't see in Kenya. It's just not possible. You also don't have, typically you don't have any visible US boots on the ground in Mombasa or Nairobi tracking the terror targets. That said, one of the things that I uncovered in the course of my investigation was that the CIA was providing intelligence support on the ground in high-value operations against terror suspects, be they renditions or kill or capture operations, in order to make sure that those operations are successful, because the CIA has particular surveillance equipment allowing them to pinpoint the location of a suspect. But to get back to your question, I think that I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump has given freer rein to the CIA to conduct more paramilitary operations. We can see that from reporting by Human Rights Watch and the Washington Post in the Afghanistan context. I don't think we can necessarily say that translates into more covert action in Kenya. I think we can only really tell on the Kenya context by looking at how many people turn up dead in raids along the coast in Nairobi, night raids in particular. And I think that those numbers have continued at a disturbing level. I asked a former senior CIA counterterrorism official, well, what will Trump make of all of this? And that former official said to me, well, Trump is, when you brief Trump and you tell him that the Kenyans just went and killed 4 people on the coast, Trump's going to say, and what's your point? Those guys are bad guys, right? And that's the prevailing narrative in the White House. This a very simplistic look at Kenya as this place of good guys and bad guys, much like Donald Trump's view of the rest of the world, right? It's no more sophisticated than that. But the problem, of course, being is that if there's no drive to hold these units accountable from the White House, then of course the CIA itself won't necessarily be holding these teams accountable. Don't get me wrong, it's important to say that the CIA is, of course, does try to hold these teams accountable to some extent. There was some conversation about accountability with the officers that I spoke to. However, at the end of the day, the CIA doesn't retain ultimate control of this team. It's a Kenyan police team, and Kenyan police teams, as you know well, John, are famously unaccountable. So there is only so much the CIA can do in this regard. And of course, if Kenya's police forces are generally unaccountable, then the CIA is not going to be able to make the one that it works with, the rapid response team, answerable in the event of a wrongful killing or a breach of the rules of engagement or heavy-handed killings. And that, of course, that is what feeds in to a sense of despair and radicalization, this complete lack of accountability.
Namir, as we go towards concluding, I said, you've investigated similar. You've worked in similar contexts before, in the Middle East and other parts of the world. What is success in this kind of thing? These are extremely difficult issues, and the rationalizations, I'm sure, on every side can be quite compelling, especially when confronted with an anxious population, that is anxious about terror. And as I said, in Kenya, we've been hit several times. We don't feel that Al-Shabaab poses an existential threat. And so, the Kenyan attitude is that, we need to deal with this, though there is concern about, when you have clerics being shot in the street, even if they are quote unquote bad guys, it's just not really in keeping with our constitution, our norms as a society, just to do that kind of thing. And so, just wanted to ask. I mean, this is a trend since 9/11, really, around the world. You know, these are issues that you've given some thought and have investigated. What does success look like when you know, in your mind?
Well, success in my mind, I think it looks very different to success in the mind of men in the White House.
Okay.
So let's. I'm sure your viewers are probably more interested in what the White House views as success, and I'll give you the answer to that in the words of one of the senior U.S. officials I spoke to, who was briefed on the rapid response team's operations in Kenya. And that former official said to me that there was one outcome that satisfied decision makers back in Washington, D.C. more than any other. And that source said to me, quote, "There's one stat that counts more than convictions, and that's neutralization of a criminal organization."
Indeed.
Now, I think that logic prevails in the current war on terror and has done for at least the past decade for two reasons. Because the likes of Guantanamo Bay and the black site network that were uncovered over a decade ago are seen simply in Washington circles as unsustainable. They're an ongoing nightmare, a moral and legal black hole, and something that President Obama obviously tried to put an end to, but failed to because of the climate of fear that pervades the US, and quite frankly, the cowardice among US decision makers to take a step to defy the fears of the US population and close that place. I think that part of the short-termism of this desire to kill problems, to whack moles as they pop up, rather than to go about this in a constructive and long-term view. I think that comes from the short-termism of the election cycle that happens every 4 to 5 years, where as soon as you're elected to power in the UK and the US, you're almost immediately thinking about how you need to satisfy the electorate in such a way as to get yourself re-elected. Now, I'm not arguing that we make 10-year election cycles or anything. I'm just merely pointing to the nature of the beast, and that this beast is encouraging decision makers in Washington to take a short-term view, and that short-term view is to kill in many instances, rather than having the problem of dealing with some of Kenya's corrupt institutions that include the judiciary, and working with them to develop to such a satisfactory way that you know that you can rely on that system to deal with a suspect in the long term. And there are really difficult issues there. For example, anti-terrorism police unit officers told me that one of their biggest problems is that NIS officers often handle evidence before they do, disrupt the chain of custody on criminal evidence, and thereby render the use of that evidence as impermissible in court because they've disrupted the chain of custody, they've broken it. And therefore the ATPU is left with a broken case against the known terror suspects. These are really deep problems that no senior in the White House wants to have to face, because how do you begin to deal with such issues? So I think that there is the short-termism that's built into US and UK foreign policy is sadly at the heart of many of these covert programs and the way they behave.
Thanks, Namir. One final question. I'm sure that we'll come back to this again. So I want to put in this question. I mean, what next for Namir Shabibi and this story?
Well, I actually hope, first of all, this story, I hope that my Kenyan colleagues, investigative journalists and activists such as yourself, keep this story alive. Only on Tuesday morning, just before dawn, and along the coast of Mombasa, another terror suspect was shot dead in a night raid. The pattern and the signatures of that raid bear the pattern that I uncovered of the rapid response team that's backed by the CIA. So it looks very much like that was another CIA-backed raid. So I want to see my Kenyan colleagues. Sadly, I don't think I'll be able to come to Kenya anytime soon, owing to some of my findings. But I would like to see my Kenyan colleagues take this story up and keep it going and hold the Kenyan government and the US government to account. Because remember that on this story, the Kenyan police service and the Ministry of Interior and the US Embassy ignored requests for comment. So somebody needs to go and knocking on those doors every time there's one of those raids and says, what are you going to do to investigate and have an independent investigation and hold perpetrators of any wrongdoing to account, as well as to compensate and provide justice to the cases of wrongful killing that I uncovered in the investigation. So I hope that the likes of yourself and your colleagues will take those steps, and of course I'm there to support that as much as I can. But for me personally, I do have some more work coming out in Kenya, specifically about how certain units of Kenyan law enforcement frame terror suspects, frame their widows, frame their partners, as well how the British Army are fighting a covert war all the way up on the Kenya-Somalia border, and some very interesting pieces on what really happened in the story of Michael Adebolajo in Kenya, the British terrorism suspect who was arrested trying to cross to Somalia to join Shabaab, and who was going to face the terror trial in Kenya, but for the intervention of the British High Commission to get him out of court and back home to the UK. A very interesting case, which I think your readers and listeners will enjoy. On the longer term, and I probably have to keep a bit more hush about this, there is a very interesting story coming on surveillance and killings in counterterrorism. So I hope we'll be talking about it when that comes out.
Namir Shabibi, on behalf of the Elephant, thank you very much, and thank you for your great work. And yes, it is very likely that we shall be speaking again. And thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks.